The words we choose to use can either create islands of isolation or build beautiful bridges of understanding. The way we communicate about something is a result of our perspective, which is either filtered through the subjective lens of fear and judgment, or the objective lens of courage and curiosity. This forms a story in our hearts and minds that is either truthful or misleading. As a culture and society, we've created a narrative around domestic violence that is victimizing and villainizing. Somehow we've reduced the lives of real people into fictional characters starring in the latest drama or heroic movie. It's as if we're in some epic battle of good versus evil, and all we need to do to experience the perfect ending is become the hero, willing to swoop in and save the victim and then punish the villain so we can all live in peace and harmony. Now, if our everyday lives were a scene out of an Avengers movie, then we could follow this script to a T. But none of us are Captain America, Black Widow, or Loki. We're humans, starring in something a little more closely related to reality TV. As an advocate, my greatest desire is to help us shift the way we talk about domestic violence in our homes and our communities. Now, growing up, I can remember hearing the story of how my parents met and fell in love. And I also recall the narrative that was echoed about the reason for their marriage ending. Around the age of 7, my mother and my brother and I were having this discussion about it when my mom said, "Audrey, your father was abusive to me." And I remember thinking, how could he? And that will never be me. I'm too strong and smart to ever allow anyone to abuse me. And at that moment, I pictured my mother as a victim who must have been stupid and weak. And I also determined my father was the villain in our story. Words matter. They shape our ideas and our beliefs. And those beliefs then drive what we do and what we think. And if we're ever going to shift the narrative on domestic violence to build these bridges of understanding, it has to start with the way we talk about it. Allow me to share a little history. The violence against women's movement was birthed out of the unsilenceable cry of women across our country demanding the violence against them stop. But what began as a civil rights cry quickly transitioned into a destructive narrative that was short-sighted and incomplete. And this contributed to things like mass incarceration or policymakers empowering a system that is biased and failing. It also contributed to people adopting negative labels that were counterproductive to their healing. And children growing up with unresolved trauma and living in permanently fractured families. Did you know, according to the CDC, if you're a man, your chances of experiencing abuse in your lifetime are 1 in 7. And if you're a woman, your chances are 1 in 3. And in the last 30 years, the number of people being impacted by domestic violence hasn't significantly been declining. But Thomas Jefferson once said, if we want something we've never had, we have to do something we've never done. And what that means to me is if we want to change anything, we have to be willing to experience a little bit of courage and lots of curiosity. Perhaps if we could lead the conversation with these two things, then we could prevent many unhealthy relationships from ever happening. I want to tell you a story about a time when I was with my counselor, having a conversation. You see, what you don't know is that domestic violence didn't just happen with my mother. Eventually, it happened with me. And during this conversation with my counselor, she was asking me to share how I was feeling about the trauma that I had recently experienced. But I couldn't answer her because right after she asked me that question, another question came to me. And I just kept wondering, what could drive a person to do such a horrific thing? Let me bring you up to speed. After a few years of being with my first husband, Chris, I decided I wanted a divorce for multiple reasons. What I didn't know at the time is that my simple request to leave would have such an incredibly tragic ending. And honestly, I felt like there had to be some sort of reason for why the man who vowed to love and protect me forever literally set me on fire and almost killed me. And I'll admit, at first, I was incredibly angry. And while it would have been easy for me to have fallen into that destructive narrative where he was the villain and I was the victim, something felt like it was missing. So I decided to soothe myself with simple philosophy. I thought, Audrey, you can never make sense out of something so senseless, which was enough to temporarily sustain my intrigue. But by the time I got back home to my apartment and stared into the faces of our two precious sons, Malachi and Malik, I decided to abandon philosophy and instead link arms with curiosity and set out on a journey of deep discovery to better inform my own healing, my work as an advocate, and the narrative I would share with my sons when they came asking. As humans, our brains are wired subjectively to protect ourselves, and this causes us to latch onto simple narratives and label things. Narratives about domestic violence, like he was just evil or she was just too weak to leave. But those descriptions fail to produce the restorative results that we actually need. For me, I decided to continue with that journey and discover what it was all really about. Something Danielle taught me, my counselor, is called cognitive reframing. It's used as a way to see a situation or a person from a slightly different angle. It's like taking the frame off of a photo and putting a new frame on it. The picture stays the same, but the story around the picture changes, which is amazing for exercising curiosity because it allows you to peel back the layers of what we see on the outside to reveal what might be happening underneath. When I peeled back the layers of what happened with Chris, I saw violence, but I didn't see a villain. Because curiosity allowed me to see that there was something deeper contributing. And the truth is, we all have a story, and Chris is no different. Chris's story is that he was placed in foster care at birth and went from home to home to home until he was 8. One could only imagine what could happen if he was triggered by the unresolved trauma of repeated childhood abandonment when I decided to leave. And please don't mistake what I'm saying as an excuse for the crime that he committed against me. This is simply the story that illuminates his pain, his reality, his humanity. When we rely on things like shame and blame to explain why people behave irrationally or even violently, we miss the root causes and obstruct our ability to see people first as human beings. Now, what about courage? Courage is something that is used when we believe that we can't do something, but we actually can. Nelson Mandela said that he learned that courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. Now, when I thought about sharing this message with all of you, I experienced an emotional tossing and turning, like a boat caught in a storm at sea. I kept swaying back and forth between the crashing currents of courage or conformity. As an advocate, I've spent a lot of times in hospitals, courtrooms, speaking at conferences, and having private conversations with survivors and advocates behind the scenes, where we often talked about our frustration with the current narrative and how it was counterproductive to healing. We also talked about our fear of bringing these forbidden exchanges to the forefront, because as advocates, we were trained to believe that advocating to shift the narrative was like an act of treason in this country. So, after a few years of having these discussions and living and operating in this sort of secret society, we decided to overcome our fear of rejection and instead pursue greater purpose over popularity. Because at the end of the day, change is really what matters, and that's what we want to see. We also understand as advocates that when children grow up in domestic violence, the result can only be one of three things. We either end up being the person who was abused, the person doing the abusing, or neither one of them. You see, it didn't take long for Malachi and Malik to become curious and courageous enough to ask me how I was burned over 80% of my body and why their father was sentenced to life in prison. But before I answered them, I thought about my own parents and the narrative I had about them, and how it was more about fear and judgment than their actual humanity. My mom is far from stupid or weak. She's actually one of the strongest women I know, and her intelligence can actually be intimidating. And my father is far from a villain. He's actually quite the softie. Unfortunately, they had no idea how to have a healthy relationship, which is a story that is way too common in this country. For Malachi and Malik, I knew whatever story that I framed around the photo of our family would impact what they thought about who they were, who we were, and what kind of world we live in. So I told them that their father made a very bad decision and had to go away, but that he loved them very much. And as they got older, that story grew piece by piece, story by story, until finally they had a bridge of understanding that would help them connect their past to their present and then author their future stories. Now, every weekend at our house, we wait for the phone to ring. And when it does, I pick it up and I listen to the recording that says, "You have a call from a correctional facility." I hit 0 to accept the call and then say, "Hi, Chris." And he says, "Hello, Audrey, can I speak to Malachi and Malik?" I then holler up the stairs, "Boys, it's your father calling." And they run down the stairs to grab the phone and say, "Hi, Dad, how was your week?" Like I mentioned in the beginning, the words we use can either create islands of isolation or build beautiful bridges of understanding. And those words and that narrative starts with you and me. Thank you for listening.